Well, when someone falls in love, oftentimes they have a pretty extravagant way of showing it, right? Have you ever witnessed someone kind of going way too far, over the top, just months of planning, financial investment, just to have like kind of a ridiculous, extravagant display of adoration for another person? This isn't quite that, but I thought back to when I was in high school, when I was like 16. I really wanted a girl to go to homecoming with me. And so I did this as like a 16-year-old. I set up hours in advance on the beach, like a walkway of candles through the woods that ended on the beach with a giant heart in roses. And will you go to homecoming with me in the middle, where I was waiting in a suit? And my friends kind of like kidnapped her and blindfolded her and dropped her off there. And it would have been, I mean, she had to say yes, right? That would have been like really awkward if she said no. And that was just trying to get someone to go to a dance with me when I was in high school. Some of you, I'm sure, if we were to ask you how you proposed, you would probably we could probably take a survey in here and find who had the most like insane, crazy, ridiculous proposal. We probably wouldn't even have to ask. We'd probably find it on Instagram or social media, because that seems to be where these things live, right? We just have a way of, when you're in love, having these ridiculous, over-the-top ways of showing it. But it's not just romance. It's not just romantic relationships where this happens. Maybe you've seen recently in the news the name Yvon Chouinard. Yvon Chouinard is the founder and the owner of the company Patagonia. And so that makes him kind of like the patron saint of Colorado, in a sense, if you think about it, right? And you may have seen that Yvon Chouinard is estimated to be worth $1.2 billion, his net worth, which is like a number that I have no category for in my brain, right? That's the only thing I can compare that to, is like I could get guac on my Chipotle literally every single time I order. That's what I would do if I had $1.2 billion. I wouldn't even think about it. Double steak and guac, yes please. Don't care how much that burrito is. So, and he seems to not care very much about being worth this much, because he recently just decided that he was giving his entire net worth through Patagonia away. All of it. He's signing the company over to a nonprofit that will help protect and preserve the environment. Why would he do that? Because he's a man in love. He's devoted. He's committed. He adores this world, the natural world that we have, and he wanted to give a display of his affection toward it. What we love has a way of causing us to do extravagant things sometimes. Our story here in Mark 14, 1 through 11, tells the story of a woman who's so overwhelmed with adoration, with worship, and devotion to Jesus that she's going to do something absolutely over-the-top extravagant. Now, to catch us up to speed, all year long we've been going through the Gospel of Mark, and now we're opening up into chapter 14, which is like the final chapter of the Gospel. It's the final chapter. Chapters 14 and 15 really zero in on the last days of Jesus' life. Sometimes this is called the Passion narrative. And the whole time we've been reading the Gospel of Mark, the author has left us these little breadcrumbs that have been foreshadowing the climax of his story, which is the death of Jesus. There's been this underlying current and tension building between Jesus and the religious leaders, and we see it just growing and growing, and it's going to come to a head here where they decide that they're going to kill him. And so what's been in the shadows throughout Mark is now going to be front and center in chapters 14 and 15. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to be zeroing in on and focusing in on what Mark wants us to, which is the death of Jesus. Now, the structure of our passage does this in a really interesting way. Mark uses here in verses 1 through 11 one of his most common literary devices. We've seen this actually several times as we've been going through the Gospel of Mark, and it's called the Markan sandwich. It's not quite as delicious as it sounds. Sounds like something you get at Snarf's, like after church, a Markan sandwich, please. But no, this is just a literary device that he uses to tell a story. And the way it works is he'll be telling a story, and he'll be moving the plot along, moving the narrative along, and then right in the middle of it, he'll just insert a totally different, separate story. He'll break the narrative, and then he'll just go like right back as if nothing happened. Now, just like a sandwich, in a sandwich, the bread is important. The bread is good and important, or for some of you, like the lettuce, whatever. The bread is important and good. But the point of the sandwich is the middle. The point of the sandwich is meat, the filling, right? That's why you eat a sandwich, for the middle. You got to have good bread, but the point is the middle. Likewise, when Mark does this, it's important, but what he's trying to do is to highlight the theme of the middle. So let me show you a little bit how this works. If you just read verses 1 through 2 and 10 through 11, they flow continuously like one story. So read with me verses 1 and 2. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. Verse 10. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money, and he sought an opportunity to betray him. Just kind of flows like one story, doesn't it? We get this story of the religious leaders who are in Jerusalem, and they hold a formal meeting where they're going to collude specifically on how to kill Jesus. Now, we are told by Mark that this happens on the Tuesday of Holy Week. We're indicated in verse 1. If you look with me, it says, it was now 2 days before the Passover. Passover was on a Thursday, and so 2 days before that would be Tuesday. So the last week of Jesus' life, just a brief timeline of it, went like this. On Sunday, Jesus made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which is what we call Palm Sunday. And then he goes back to Bethany, which was a small little village 2 miles outside the city, which is where he was spending his time in between trips to Jerusalem. He goes back and he sleeps. On Monday, he comes back into Jerusalem and he cleanses the temple, and he overturns the tables and drives out the money changers. And this is the moment when the religious leaders have decided that's the final straw. He's got to go. We can't have this guy anymore. We have to kill him like yesterday. So that's on Monday. On Tuesday, they host this secret meeting where they're going to collude on a plan to kill him. Wednesday, we actually don't know what Jesus did. We're not indicated in any of the Gospels that he did anything on that Wednesday. My best guess is that he took a little PTO. He's like, been a hard day, drove a donkey into town, turned some tables over, could use a day off, takes a little hike around the Mount of Olives, rests a little bit. This probably would have been the perfect day for Judas to sneak out and to meet with the religious leaders, which is verses 10 and 11, and betray Jesus. So that's Wednesday. Thursday is where he celebrates the Passover or the Last Supper with his disciples. And then that evening we have the betrayal, the arrest of Jesus, a hasty trial that extends into Friday morning, where eventually Jesus is killed on a Friday afternoon. That's the plot. That's the story Mark is going to tell in these next few chapters. But right in the middle, he pulls like a little bit of a Tarantino move right here, and he goes back in time. He messes with the chronology of the story. In fact, I imagine when Quentin Tarantino was sitting down to write Pulp Fiction, he was reading the Gospel of Mark, and he was like, that is a brilliant storytelling device, Mark. I shall borrow it with John Travolta. So he pulls a little story here. He does a flashback because verses 3 through 9 take place on Saturday, previous to Jesus' triumphal entry. So you have Tuesday, back a few days, Saturday, Wednesday. Okay, why is he doing that? Why would he mess with the chronology of the story and put a flashback in? Well, it's because he's trying to highlight the theme of verses 3 through 9. He's trying to draw that out by making this contrast between the darkness of what's happening between the religious leaders and Judas and this plot to kill him with this beautiful display of extravagant worship and devotion that this woman shows. And he's doing this because it's meant to teach us something, the reader, about the death of Jesus, and then how he wants us or is inviting us to respond. So let's get into this woman's story, and you'll see what I mean. Mark opens it in verse 3 like this. While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, so he's at dinner, and the first century table dinners, their tables were just a few feet off the ground. They didn't sit in chairs. Rather, it was this U-shaped table, and there would have been cushions all around the table. And at dinner, you would recline, like literally in a reclined position, so that you were leaning on the cushion and your head was towards the table where you could eat and rest and have conversation. So this is just a very normal dinner scene with Jesus and his disciples and his friends and those who are in the house. So he's reclining at table, and a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. Now, this very normal scene becomes very abnormal very quickly. This woman comes in, and Mark tells us she's holding an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard. Now, at first, this might have seemed normal because in this time it would have been customary to take what this is just like basically perfume or essential oils, is to take a little bit of it. And, this isn't a very hygienic period in the history of the world. Like, not a lot of showers happening, and they're in this small room eating dinner. So you can imagine if you want to have a nice dinner party, it probably doesn't smell too good. So it's like, let's take out this nice expensive perfume, dab a little bit on the guest, dab a little bit on Jesus, like he's an extra special guest of honor, and let's try to brighten the mood, with some good smells in here a little bit. So this is kind of normal, but it would have turned some heads because she's got a very, very, very nice jar of perfume. So maybe she's trying to impress Jesus, like, hey, I'm bringing out the good stuff for you. And we're told about this perfume that it's pure nard. Pure nard was a substance that would only have come from the Himalayas. So think like India or Nepal. And somehow it had traveled all the way, probably through great expense, to Israel into the hands of this woman. And it's highly fragrant, and so it has to be kept in an alabaster flask, which is like a really nice, expensive, round stone jar in order to lock in the scent and preserve the precious ointment inside. And then we're told in verse 5 that it's worth more than 300 denarii. Denarius, you have a little footnote there in your Bible if you look, and it'll tell you that one denarius is worth a day's wage for a laborer. So 300 is basically a year's salary for your average laborer. So we want to translate that into like kind of modern times. We could maybe think this jar of perfume is worth like $35,000. That is some expensive perfume. That's like, I'm not like a buy perfume for my wife guy, but I would think maybe $60 would be where I like cap off, and I'm like not going above that. In fact, I don't think I own anything, not even a single item in my home worth 1 year of my salary. And I certainly don't own any essential oils worth that much. So we're talking about like a family heirloom. It's almost priceless, passed down from generation to generation. They may have this one item as like their family trust, their savings account, her 401k. This is like probably the best, nicest, most expensive thing she owns. So you can imagine how utterly shocking it would be to see her not just dab a little bit on Jesus, but to smash it and dump the whole thing out over his head, and we're also told all over his body and his feet. You can picture it happening. You could hear it smashing. You can smell the fragrance. It would have just like lit up the room with its smell. So what does this mean? What's the meaning of this? Well, in the story, the alabaster flask is meant to represent her whole life. And not just as like a metaphor, it's literally her whole life. It's her savings account. It's the nicest thing she has. Right? We'll see Jesus say right here in verse 8, she has done what she could in reaction to what she's done. She's done what she could, which we could also translate, she's done the most possible extravagant thing that she could. She's given me everything she has. So this is just an extravagant act of love and devotion. It's meant to show her degree of worship to Jesus. She broke the jar as if to say, there's no part of me left that you can't have, Jesus. I'm wholly devoted to you. Now, how would you react to something like that? If you're in the room with her, how would you react? Her devotion, it contrasts in the story really sharply with the other characters in the passage, doesn't it? Right? We have these other characters in the passage. We have the beginning, we have the religious leaders, and what are they doing? They're trying to get rid of Jesus. He's a nuisance to them. He's become a threat to them. And so they're trying to plot and to kill him to get rid of him. And then you have Judas in verses 10 and 11. And Judas, though being one of the 12 who's been with Jesus for 3 years, who's been counted among his closest friends, he's going to betray Jesus for just a little bit of money. Right? It says that the religious leaders in verse 11 When they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him some money, which we know later is 30 pieces of silver. So consider the financial sacrifice this woman just made for Jesus, contrasted with just the little bit of money it took for Judas to sell him out. So those are a couple of the reactions. And as you hear these reactions, it should elicit response in you like, who am I? Where do I align? And then you have those in the room with the woman. We read about their reaction in verse 4. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was the ointment wasted like that? They're indignant, which means they're like provoked. They're displeased. They're angry at her. And then they don't just keep their anger to themselves, like they take it out on her. In front of everyone, they're gonna scold her. Like she's gonna get our anger here. Look at verse 5. For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor, and they scolded her. Now, when I read that, a piece of me is like, they kind of make a good point, don't they? Like, if you're reading this rightly, you should be like, that's kind of a valid point. Like, she did just waste $35,000 worth of ointment in like 5 seconds to anoint Jesus. Like, I imagine Jesus himself wouldn't have wanted her to do that, right? They probably think, in fact, they're sticking up for Jesus here. Like, wasn't Jesus all about ministering to the poor? Wasn't that a huge part of his ministry, of his teaching, of the example he showed in his life? They're probably like, this is our moment. We know this is going to make Jesus mad. We've seen him get mad at other things. We got this, Jesus. Scold her. She went against you. She didn't do what we know that you've commanded us to do, to care for those in need. So Mark's written this in a way to elicit your reaction, to get you to that point, to be provoked, because he wants to set you up to then hear how surprising it would be when Jesus responds to her. This is what he says in verse 6. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me." She has done a beautiful thing. Now, this could also be translated, she's done something good, or she's done something right, as if to say, what she's done is the proper and right response in this moment to me. Yes, it seems rash. It certainly looks nonsensical, over the top, maybe even anti what I'm about. Like, you just heard me scold a rich young ruler and tell him, give everything you have to the poor and then follow me. You've seen this through my life and my ministry. It may seem anti-me, and yet from the very mouth of Jesus, he says, no, this is actually a fitting and right response to me. Leave her alone. Don't trouble her. That's his way of validating her, of acknowledging her, and accepting her act of worship as right. Now, you don't have to be a Bible genius to know that when Jesus says something is beautiful and good, we should probably pay attention. That's probably a hint to us that he's trying to teach us, the reader, something. And right now, what he's trying to teach us is something about worship. See, worship is what you love the most. Worship is what informs your thoughts and your habits the most. It's what you give your affection and your attention to, what you think about, how you make decisions. Really, what you center your whole life around is ultimately what you worship. And so the natural question that arises out of reading this is, do I love Jesus like this woman does? Do I see this as a proper and fitting response to Jesus with my life? Or like if you were to do a little self-examination and just kind of think on your life, and namely think on what your life looks like Monday through Saturday, would you be like, honestly, there are parts of me I know I'm holding back from him. Like, I'm okay to give him this here and this here, but it's like when it comes to my finances, or when it comes to this relationship, or when it comes to this decision or this habit or this belief, if I'm honest, I haven't really given that over to Jesus. I see that as mine. Jesus says, she's done a beautiful thing. And then he's going to make this somewhat perplexing statement. Like, if we're not careful, this can be actually kind of confusing, or if we misinterpret this could be a bit misleading. Look at what he says in verse 7. He says, "For You always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. Then you first read that, it seems like Jesus is being a little dismissive of the poor, right? It's like he's saying like, oh, well, you can get around to that anytime, but what's really important is worship. And so we have to be careful here, and we have to be clear. Jesus is not pitting the worship of him against caring for those in need. That's a false dichotomy. He's not pitting those things against one another. And we know that for two reasons. One is that would be inconsistent with his own teaching and ministry. Like he directly commands it. He exemplifies it over and over again with his life and with his teaching. So it would contradict his own teaching if that were the case. And secondly, it's because of what he's saying here and what he's quoting. When he says this statement in verse 7, "For you always have the poor with you," this is actually a quote of Deuteronomy 15:11. And a little interpretive trick when you're reading the New Testament is oftentimes New Testament writers will throw out very short snippets and very short little, almost like proof texts of Old Testament passages. And the thing that's clear, what they're trying to do is they're not just quoting what they've said, but they're actually making reference to the context in which that passage falls. So if you see them quoting the Old Testament, the thing to do is to look up the reference, go back to the Old Testament, and read the whole chapter in which that quote was found. And that helps you understand what they're really trying to say. So Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy 15:11, but he has in mind the context of the whole passage of Deuteronomy 15. And so let's just look at a piece of that passage, 7 through 11, to understand what he's saying. He says, "If among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. Take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart and you say, 'The seventh year, the year of release is near,' and your eye look grudgingly on your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry to the Lord against you, and you be guilty of sin. You shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him. Because for this the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. For there will never," this is the quote, "for there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore, because of that reality, I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in your land." Now, it would make no sense for Jesus to quote a passage that in the context directly commands caring for the poor as a way of dismissing the poor. So what he's doing here is he's making what's called a greater than argument. There's the opposite of this is a contrast. A contrast is where you show how insignificant or invaluable something is in order to make the valuable thing shine. Right? Contrast is what Mark is doing between the religious leader's response and this woman's response. No, a greater than argument is where you talk about how important and significant something is in order to show how much greater significance this other thing has. So what he's saying is, hey, you know how important care for the poor is in my kingdom. Like, you know this. You've seen it in my ministry. I've demonstrated it with my life. You know it's commanded by God in the Old Testament that God's people are always going to be people who give of themselves, who care for, who take care of the needy. Because you know that, how much more significant and valuable is it what she's done? Now, how can that be? How can what she's done be even more significant and valuable than that? Well, he tells us in verse 8, "She has done what she could. She's anointed my body beforehand for burial." The one time in history, in space and time event of Jesus' death takes precedence in this moment over anything else you could possibly imagine. Remember, this is the Saturday before Jesus is killed on a Friday, and he knew it. So he's only going to be with them a few days more. These are precious, precious moments, precious hours, precious minutes. He knows the very hour of his death is approaching, and when that hour comes, he's going to be treated like a common criminal, crucified between a thief and a murderer. They're going to choose to let a murderer and an insurrectionist go instead of him. He's going to be abandoned by his followers, his closest friends, and those who pledged loyalty to him. And even in his death, beyond just the excruciating physical pain of crucifixion, he's going to experience the entire weight of the world's darkness in his soul, to be even cut off from fellowship with his Father. He's going to be treated like the Passover lamb, slaughtered and sacrificed to bear the very judgment of God. The prophet Isaiah, in looking forward to the death of the Messiah, describes it like this in Isaiah 53, 7 and 9. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? And they made his grave with the wicked. He'll be counted like a criminal in his death. And with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. These are precious last days before his death. But in them, this woman gives us a glimmer of light. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. This was customary at this time before a body would be buried after it had died, to embalm the body with spices and ointments, much like the one that she pours on him here. So she's saying, you're not a common criminal. You're not a thief to be thrown to the grave with the wicked, as Isaiah told us he would be. That's not who you are. She gives him some dignity. She says, you deserve the burial of a king. Now, if you identify in this story as maybe one of the onlookers who's perplexed, confused, maybe even indignant at what this woman is doing, like she's kind of wasting her life on Jesus, it's not very practical. It may be because, and it probably is because, you haven't grasped the meaning of his death. And I don't just mean like you know the answer to the question, why did Jesus die on the cross? To save me from my sin, to forgive me of all that I've done wrong, to cleanse my conscience, to restore me to reconciliation with the Father. Like maybe you can say that, but like you've actually experienced it and felt it like deep in your soul. I have a friend who a few years ago, she got together with a group of friends to climb Mount Rainier in Washington. And they summited Mount Rainier, and on the way back, they actually got in a pretty horrific, life-threatening accident. One of them slipped down a glacier, and they slid down the glacier and were only saved by a giant crack in the ground where they were literally dangling for their life. And they had to send in a rescue helicopter with 3 climbing rangers to help pull them out and save them. And tragically, while this was happening, one of the rangers slipped on the glacier and fell to his death. And I got to sit with her, and she explained this experience to me, and the debt of gratitude that she expressed for this man who was a hero, who literally gave his life so that she could have life and be rescued. She says she thinks of him often. She considers him. She's grateful beyond measure for his sacrifice for her life. When you see the extravagant act of the death of Jesus for you, like when it sinks down deep into your soul that you know it's for you, you'll know that her response is beautiful and good. You'll see it as right. You'll see it as fitting, that it makes perfect sense. Now that's actually what Jesus means here in verse 9. Look again with me at what he says in verse 9. He says to them all after this response, he says, truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Now, this actually has 2 meanings. This has like an overt meaning and a subtle meaning. The overt meaning is that whenever the story of Jesus is told, she's going to be mentioned. I imagine like when Jesus said that, the disciples were like making a mental note. If I ever write this down, include this story. Got it, right? And it's true, right? Here we are, 2,000 years later, we're sharing the gospel and we're telling her story. Everywhere in the whole world, what she's done is mentioned. Jesus was right about that. But there's also this subtle meaning to what he said, which is that when he says, what she has done, he's saying what she has done is a picture of the gospel. Jesus is the most valuable, worthy, possible thing that you can imagine in the universe. Far more valuable than a stone alabaster jar of expensive perfume. He's the creator of everything, who's given us breath in our lungs, who's given us our bodies and our minds and the whole world that we have. And beyond that, he's the most perfect human who's ever lived. He's perfect humanity embodied. He's the most valuable thing you could possibly imagine, and yet he broke his body and poured his entire life out for you and me. His body broken was like the flask, his blood poured out like the ointment inside, and he did this to cleanse you, to make you pure, to wash away your guilt and your shame, to reconcile you to your Father, which is the deepest longing of your heart. And so when you let the death of Jesus and the meaning of his death wash over you, to sink into your soul, to pour out over your head and your body and your feet and all of you, you'll see that the right and fitting response to him is to give him your worship, to give him your adoration, to give him your devotion. And so maybe you're in here, and as you're hearing this and really as you experience like a church service, like none of it really makes sense to you. Like maybe it even feels a little over the top. You see people singing, some people raising their hands, some people praying, devoting their time, devoting their resources, devoting their lives to this person, Jesus, and it's all a bit strange, right? It's all a bit like weird, and it probably should be a little weird because there's not really anything else in our society that lines up or matches it, and so it's just kind of like maybe you feel like an outsider observing something kind of strange. Well, the question for you then is, do you grasp the meaning of the death of Jesus? And when I say that, I mean, do you see it as something for you, like something that you need? If you do, if you come to understand it, you'll know that worship and devotion is the right and proper. It's the only response to him. And so maybe for you, something you could do even just in our time this morning is you could pray and ask God, show me the meaning of your death. Help me experience something beautiful and good that you've done for me. Or maybe you're in here and you're like, no, I'm a Christian. I'm comfortable calling myself and identifying as a Christian. Like Jesus is important to me, but you sense he's like way less significant than a lot of other things in your life. Like to use our metaphor here, like maybe if you were bringing out the expensive ointment, you would dab like a little bit on him. Be like, you can have a little bit of this, Jesus, but the idea of like pouring the whole thing out is like too much for you. Well, maybe you don't fully realize the extent of what Jesus has done. And so for you, I would just ask, consider his death again. Think about it, and then ask, like, what would devotion look like in my life? Like if I were even just to take just one step of greater devotion and greater worship, what would that mean for me? What would that look like for me in my life? And lastly, maybe you're in here and you're just sort of like discontent. Like discontent with your faith. It feels cold or distant or waning, or you're wrestling through it and you're not really sure about how things are going with your life or with your faith, or you have this habit or this sin that you keep returning to. You just feel like weighed down and burdened. Then the invitation for you this morning is return again to the death of Jesus. In fact, oftentimes when people are seeking renewal, when they describe dry or distant periods of their life and they're asking God, they have this discontent, they're asking God for renewal, they'll often describe that when they experience renewal, it was because of a very real encounter with the death of Jesus. That the death of Jesus took on a new meaning or old meaning made real to you again, and it really sunk down in a way that it hadn't been. And that's what really sparked and was the catalyst for renewal. And so for you, just meditate on it. Think on it. Feel it sink down deep into your soul. And then give him your worship. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for this morning as an opportunity to worship you and an opportunity to give you thanks. And I just ask that we would be struck with just vivid portrayal of what it looks like to pour ourselves out and to worship you, Lord. And we only do that as a response to what you've given us in the gospel and what you've given us in the death of your son, Jesus. And so I pray that that would just be made real to our hearts this morning, that we would know so clearly the extent of the sacrifice that is the cross, that we would feel it wash over us. For those burdened by sin this morning, let them experience the grace and love of you, Jesus. For those distant from you or far from you, let them see how near you are to them in your death that's given us even your very presence with us this morning. And for my friends who maybe have never really fully understood, I hope that you would make the death of Jesus clear to them this morning as an atoning sacrifice for sin, that they need to be reconciled to you, Father. So we pray right now that you would experience our worship as we pour ourselves out to you. In Jesus' name, amen.